Hello, I am Thelma Johnson, the president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Martha's Vineyard Branch. Today we will be talking to a veteran who is also a member of our branch and a member of our executive committee. He will share with, his name is, excuse me for that, Gerard Peterson. He will share with us some of the experiences he had while he served in the Army. Today, we're happy to have him, and we hope that you will enjoy the information that he will share with us. Good morning.
Good morning.
Would you first tell us which branch of the service you were in and what you did?
I was a member of the United States Army. I was drafted into the Army after my first and second years in college. I was a member of the ROTC as a freshman and sophomore, but decided not to go on to become an officer. Didn't know it, but that immediately made me eligible for the draft. And that January, I received a notice that said, "Greetings, you are to report to New Haven, Connecticut. You are drafted into the U.S. Army." So I went to basic training, eventually in Pennsylvania, a place called Indiantown Gap Military Reservation. It was chosen because it was this perfect terrain that duplicated the kind of terrain in Korea. Oh, okay. At that time, we were in what was called a Korean conflict. It wasn't a war, it was a conflict. But there were several thousand soldiers, sailors, Marines that were stationed in Korea, and the casualties were very high. Okay. Thousands of people died and were injured in that process.
Mm-hmm. But while you were in camp training, tell me what that was like.
Well, it was actually a 2-month training period for the infantry. Therefore, we had to learn how to use weapons, how to survive in that cold, mountainous climate, how to march long distances with heavy equipment to be ready for a battle when you arrived. We were in the 5th Regimental Combat Team, which meant we were going to be the frontline soldiers in Korea. The mountains were high, they were very rugged. We slept outside, frequently on the ground. Some of us were smart enough to go get fir branches from trees to make mattresses, but mostly we slept on the ground.
Okay. What exactly did you do after the training?
Well, after the training, my outfit was sent to Korea. At that time, the Korean conflict was about 3 years old, I think. So our outfit went immediately to the front lines. Without my knowing it, the sergeant responsible for our company put my name in as a candidate for officers training program.
Oh, okay.
I didn't realize that he did that. He did that for 3 or 4 people. He recommended that we go to OCS rather than going directly to Korea. So I was put in a holding area waiting to find out whether I was going to go to officer training program. And during that time, the Korean conflict came to an end.
Oh, boy.
In July 1953, the Korean conflict was paused. I guess it was a truce, maybe. And that even exists until today. We never had a declared end of that conflict or war.
So you're being selected to be an officer prevented you from seeing combat. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And then the combat ended, and I was then asked if I was interested in going to the Quartermaster Corps. I was in the infantry at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And the Quartermaster Corps was something that dealt with logistics of the Army. That is, in my case, the food supply for a base. And because I had some knowledge of how to use a desk calculator and had a little bit of statistics while I was in school, I was given an office job. And my job was to calculate every day how many pounds and cans and whatever it is that we used as ways of measuring that each company in the base received in order to feed their troops. There's something that's called the master menu that comes out of Washington, D.C. Every person in those days in the Army ate the same thing every day. I mean, every soldier ate the same thing because of the menu that the company commander received, and he would pass it on to the mess sergeant, and the mess sergeant would feed based on the menu.
Okay.
But I was the one who said, coming out of the warehouse, how many cans of tomatoes and how many chickens and how many cans of beans and how many packages of cake mix you received based on the number of people that you had to feed.
You know, having talked to 2 other veterans, I can see that having some college education, it was a bonus being in the Army, because each of you had had more of responsibilities that did not involve combat. That's interesting factor there.
Absolutely. And one of the ways that I think there were 4 people in our office. One of the ways that we determined how to do this more efficiently was to get together ourselves and say, we can do this and we can do that, and you do this and I'll do that. And so we streamlined it, and at one point we were able to finish our work literally by 11 o'clock in the morning. We'd go to work at 7 and we'd be finished by 11.
Wise thinking. Now tell me, did you receive any medals? I understand you had an office job, but did you receive any kind of medals?
Only the Good Conduct Medal, you know, for being a reasonable person, I guess, while you're in the service. Everybody, I think, gets one of those.
Okay. Now, how did you stay in touch with your family during that time?
Oh, it was easy. The mail system was very good for the Army. I don't know about the other services, but everything that you wrote and mailed would get home to Connecticut, where most of my family lived, in a day or 2. And obviously, people mailing into me was, you know, one of the great things in life was to go to mail call and really receive some mail. That meant that people were concerned about you.
Okay. Okay. So you had leave time while you were in service. What did you do when you were on leave?
I didn't really get a lot of leave time. As I remember, in the basic training, we'd get a weekend off. And based on whether or not you, in inspection, were one of the top people looking like you were, you know, the more you dressed it, and the sharper you were, and the more starch you were, and the more your tie was correct, and your hat, and all that sort of stuff. And if you were named the sergeant of the guard, then you would get 3 days off on a weekend rather than 2. And I was really fortunate, and when I was in Pennsylvania, I would get on the bus and go to New York, where I had a very close friend from school, and would stay with him and his family. So going to New York for me was like, you know, going home in a sense. And when I was in Virginia, at Camp Pickett, Virginia, I would go on the weekend to Virginia State, where I had a friend who was going to school there, and his roommate would go home on weekends, so I lived with him on weekends at the university. In fact, the president of the university actually thought that I was a student there. He saw me so frequently, and he would say, "Hello, how are studies going?" I say, "Fine." But Virginia State, and when I was in Kentucky, at Fort Knox, Kentucky, that was my last station. I went to Kentucky State in Lexington. Actually, you know, those are the places that I spent my weekends. So
That's unusual. None of the party clubs, that is. Okay. Did you ever participate in any kind of pranks while you were in the service? I've heard
fights.
Pranks, fights, whatever. Okay. Pranks, not
Oh,
fights.
pranks. No,
Tricks.
no, we
Okay.
didn't have any time for that sort of thing.
Okay.
When we were in basic training, we were all concerned about going into combat, and really we were more interested in having some fun, and because weren't sure we were coming back. Okay. You know, that was the pervading kind of attitude was, let's go have some fun and enjoy ourselves, because once we get to Korea, it isn't going to be any fun.
All righty. Now, what did you think of your fellow soldiers and officers, and how did you get along with them?
In basic training, the non-commissioned officers had already served in combat. So they were really serious about showing us how to survive, how to not go over there and get killed, because that's the worst thing that could possibly happen to you. But the officers were not that skilled. They weren't that well trained. The officer responsible for my company was an ROTC graduate. He had just graduated. He had never been in the service except for as long as I was there, you know, a few months. So having him as our leader was not a good idea. So, you know, in a sense, we all decided to be more concerned about what Sergeant Long said rather than Lieutenant Makovic, because he didn't know what he was talking about.
Okay. Okay. Seems wise to me. Seems wise to me.
One of the things you learned in the Army is how to survive. I mean, that was the most important thing. That, you know, I want to go home someday. I don't want to go into combat and never come out. So, but my ROTC training did give me a step up. You know, I was chosen to be a squad leader and then the platoon guide. I was responsible for the members of the people in my platoon. That was probably 50 people.
Tell me two very memorable things that happened to you while you were in the service.
One of the things I learned was draftees weren't necessarily the best people to consider as soldiers, members of the Army. And it came clear to me when we were out camping and it was beginning to snow, and our responsibility was to take our tents and put them up before snow, because we're going to be sleeping there that night. And one of the soldiers was my none of the other members of the group wanted him to be their person, to be their team member. So I, being the guy in charge, said, well, I'll take him. And his name was Rutledge. And Rutledge, Private Rutledge, all during the time it's snowing and everybody else is putting their tents up, was standing there crying, saying, I want to go home, as if none of us wanted to stay where we were. And I said, Rutledge, you got to put the tent together. You put the tent together, I'll go get the leaves, the branches from the trees, so I have something, And I just couldn't get him to move. I mean, he was not able to do what he was supposed to do. So I put the tent up myself. We both slept in it. Most of the night he was sobbing and I want to go home, I want to go home. And about 3 weeks later, something happened where he was given a release from the service because mentally he could not handle it. He was sent back home.
Oh, okay.
And that was one of the most memorable experiences for me. And some people who came who had problems the way we all had grew up during that period of time, and some just didn't. And I couldn't imagine what happened when they go to combat. I mean, if you're frightened in training, what happens when you hear those bombs going off? And, people start charging toward you, ready to do you in. But that was the most memorable experience. The other one was when I was in the office in Virginia, in Camp Pickett, Virginia. The captain responsible for us was a guy named Captain Evans. And Captain Evans came to work every day drunk. He just was an alcoholic. There wasn't any two ways about that. We didn't need him. I mean, we were able to do what needed to be done without him. And when he wasn't around, we even did better. Because on occasion, he would ask us to do things which made no sense at all. He was very biased, and I was the only African American in the group, so he kind of leaned on me on occasion. But if you can imagine somebody coming to work really after having 4 or 5 martinis, get up in the morning and you go and you drink, there's something wrong. And he never was promoted again. I mean, I think, but they didn't put him out. They just let him pretend to be in charge of this, what was an office, and it was the food service division, and he theoretically was the number 3 officer in that division.
Is that the same place where you work, getting the food distributed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what I did. Once I came out of basic training, that was my MOS.
Define MOS.
Yeah.
Define MOS.
Military occupational specialty.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I learned something. Okay. Now, do you recall the day your service ended?
I remember it, never forget it. But I was drafted in the service in January 5th, 1953, and I was released on January 6th, 1955. I had to stay in the Army 1 extra day. And that was because the people who worked in the office that processed our releases had a party, and hardly any of them came to work the next day. So all the people who were supposed to get out that day, January 5th, had to wait till January 6th. And Thelma, what I did was I got the cab driver This is in Fort Knox, Kentucky. I got the cab driver to be outside the door so that when I received my release papers and my money, I went directly to the cab and he took me to the train station, and I jumped on the train and went to New York to celebrate my release from the service, and then eventually went back home to Connecticut.
Okay. What did you do afterwards? Did you work or go to school?
I went directly back to school as soon as I retired, as soon as I was released from the Army. I went back to the University of Connecticut, and this time it was a wonderful experience because I was on the GI Bill. Every month I received $125, and during the summers I worked and paid for my tuition and room and board. So what's $125 was, I mean, just big money. It was incredibly, large money, and my roommate was also a veteran, so between the two of us, we had $250 a month.
Okay. Now, did you make any lasting relationships while you were in the service that continue today?
No, I never did. I traveled around a lot. I met a lot of good people, and most of them were people that I worked with. I played on the basketball team in Fort Knox, and did have some good friends there, but and I taught golf to a guy who was a major in our regimental commander. I gave him golf lessons, so I did have a nice relationship with him. But once it was over, I went back to Connecticut and
Okay.
never saw or even heard of. Well, I heard of some of the people, but from New England, but I never did run into them.
Well, what did you do as a career after the war?
After I finished my Army service, I went back to school, and I was thinking about going into engineering, and I took another economics course, and it was really so fascinating, I decided to major in economics.
Okay.
And when I graduated in 1957, I went to work for the Aetna Life and Casualty as a computer programmer trainee. I was one of the first business computer programmers in the United States, actually.
Okay.
We were just learning how to use the computer, and actually in those days we didn't buy the computer, we leased it from IBM.
Okay.
And the question was, are we going to keep it, or is it something that's kind of a flash in the pan? And it turned out that computers are here to stay.
And how?
But we didn't know it at the time. We were just learning how to do things. And I stayed with the Aetna for a long enough period of time to become involved in marketing, and went off at the Aetna's request to work with the Secretary of Labor for a year, using my expertise to help with what we were calling the equal employment opportunity possibility for the U.S. government. President Lyndon Johnson passed an executive order, 11246, which required the people and organizations that were doing business with the U.S. government to have an equal employment opportunity concept. And in theory, they would punish, I guess that's a good word, the companies that didn't do it by taking their contracts away.
Oh, I see.
And in those days, that was serious business. I did that for a year, but I came back to the Aetna and was offered a chance to become the assistant dean of the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University because of a friend who was the assistant to the president of the university. And while I was traveling to California, he invited me down to Stanford. I met the dean of the business school, and he asked me to become the assistant dean. So I did that for about 4 years. And while I was back in Hartford raising money from the Aetna for Stanford, I saw the CEO, and he asked me if I was interested in coming back to the Aetna.
Okay.
And he said, I think you ought to consider it. And I went to sit with him in his office, and he called the director of personnel, and we decided that there were some things that I probably should be looking at. So I did went back to work for the Aetna.
Okay, well, in what position did you go?
As the manager of the project that was going to be the forerunner of what we call managed care these days.
Okay.
And that's the concept that most insurance companies use. But this was in 1974, and we didn't complete that. There was a recession in 1975 that meant that we weren't going to do that experiment anymore. So I went back into being the manager of the group insurance division.
I see.
And then I was given an opportunity by the city manager of Hartford to go manage the sports arena, the Hartford Civic Center, which was a concert and sports arena, and it was the largest one in New England. And I did that for about 10 years.
Oh man, you had a varied career.
And so I had a very interesting career in many facets of business, and finished my career with a firm called Johnson Controls. And I also did a year as the vice president of the Urban League.
Oh, okay.
So I've done lots and lots of things, thanks to the U.S. Army.
Tell me this, do you belong to any veterans organizations?
Yeah, I'm still a member of the American Legion in Hartford, Connecticut. I keep up my dues with them and drop in and see them whenever I'm in the Connecticut area. But they're a very important institution in Hartford. They do a lot of good community things as well as something that's related to the Army or the service.
Mm-hmm. Do you go to reunions of anything like that with any other military people?
Pardon me?
Do you go to any reunions or with any other military people?
No, not really. I probably would go to American Legion convention, but it's not high on my list.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned some interesting things about your Army life, but how did the Army really affect your life?
One of the things I learned in the Army was how to manage a very diverse group of people. I mean, I had some responsibility of supervising in my basic training period a group of people that, we didn't know each other, we didn't necessarily like each other, we didn't necessarily understand each other. Some people came from New England, others came from New York and Pennsylvania, Maryland. There were only 5% of us were African American. So as somebody in charge of my particular platoon, as it was called, I'm sure some of the people I was managing were quite surprised to have an African American manager, you know. And this was only 6 or 7 years after President Truman in 1958 integrated the armed services. So we weren't integrated, you know, very long when I went in '53. And that experience for me wasn't very much different from what I had when I was growing up, because I grew up in a neighborhood that wasn't, there weren't too many African American people, but managing people, I learned a lot of that in the Army, even though it was a short period of time. The other thing I learned was that when you had some kind of responsibility, there was a way to refine it and to make it better. And that was something that we did on our own. We didn't ask to become more efficient. We just went and did it. And I was saying earlier, you know, at one point we were so good that by 11 o'clock in the morning we were finished. Well, and in the afternoon we would go to the swimming pool and go to play golf or something. You know,
play golf. Okay. Okay, we've asked a lot of questions of you. Is there anything that you'd like to share that we didn't ask?
Well, I think that people who were drafted in my experience anyway, it became beneficial in the final analysis. So that to me, if everyone had to be responsible for spending some portion of their life in government service or in community service, I think that would be something that we should consider, especially for folks in the 18 to 23-year-old category. I mean, to give each of us something that we can do that will benefit the community. And I didn't want to get drafted, but now that I look back on it, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me.
And with that, I say thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us.
You are quite welcome. I enjoyed it as much as you did.
Thank you.